This series of videos introduces the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. It's a project of the Social Change Lab, and we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Mary Lee Bequest for the work of our team.
Hi, everyone. My name's Winifred Lewis, and I'm a professor of social psychology at the University of Queensland.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea Zhang. I'm a psychologist and a research assistant in University of Queensland.
Hi, I'm Napa Sarnan. I'm a psychology student at UQ.
Welcome, everyone. And of course, we're here because we're making videos about the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. And the chapter that we're doing today is about the conservation movement. It's titled Environmental Conservation, and it's written by Angela Mertig, a professor of sociology at Middle Tennessee State University. One of the questions that comes up, surprisingly to me, Andrea, was what is conservation? Do you want to tell us a little about that?
Yes, so conservation is a term that we broadly use to describe like all the behaviors and actions human beings initiated to protect the environment and protect the earth. And when we come to discuss the conservation movement in the US, it actually was split into two broad camps. So the first one is the preservationist, and the second is the conservationist. And these two broad camps both make efforts to protect the environment in the US, but they are slightly different due to their different purpose. So the preservationist, they mostly focus their efforts on setting aside protected areas, such like parks, forests, and wilderness areas, to protect the wildlife and their habitats from human use. And conservationism, on the other side, is more like they emphasize the stewardship of the natural resources, and they continue use for the greatest good to the greatest number of people. So the underlying philosophy for that is that through government regulation and scientific management, we can overcome the intensive misuse of natural resources.
Yeah, and that they evolved sort of together, but I guess preservation is a bit first, right? Tell us about the author's discussion of the history of the American conservation movement.
Yes, so the preservationists kind of make a successful progress in the American history. And one of the example is the establishment of the Yellowstone National Park. So it is established in the 1890s, and it is the very first national park that is set aside as a land to without being used by human.
And I think it might be, sorry to jump in, might be the Yosemite National Park, which I think as foreigners we're also impressed by all of the American national parks, but the first national park, Yosemite.
Oh yes, that is Yosemite. Thanks, Winifred.
Cool. And I remember that the kind of reaction, the reason why it happened in the late 1800s was because the American frontier was closing. That is, the settlement of the country had kind of pushed across from east to the west coast, and there was a sense that wilderness areas were disappearing.
Yeah, and it is also because besides the frontiers closing, there's also a intense industrialization, and just arouse people's concerns about there are particular species there is just disappearing. So people are very willing to take efforts and protect those wildlife and wilderness area.
And I also remember this discussion of these philosophies called Romanticism and Transcendentalism. What on earth are they?
So the romantic, conservation movements in the United States is actually has its origin, maybe inspired by the romantic movements from the romantic movements is about the beliefs that the natural world is a source of inspiration, imagination, creativity, freedom, and beauty. So it is like a spiritual, and it has its spiritual and beauty, like its beauty in value that can benefit human beings. We um, so we kind of have to preserve it as a refugee for humanity, and that is
Yeah.
the underlying philosophy under Romantic movement.
Yeah, and I think transcendentalism from memory was the American version of this. So it was a kind of Christian movement saying that, or maybe beyond that, saying that you connect with God through nature. And if you're alienated from nature, you know, you run the risk of these moral failures. So by spending time in nature, you can be more mentally and physically ill and more spiritually uplifted. So that was part of the philosophy. And then I guess in the 20th century, there was a bit of another wave, a second wave of conservation movements. Do you want to tell us about that, Napasorn?
Okay, so the second wave is called the contemporary environmental movement. So this is after World War II. People, like there were increases in education, affluence, and leisure time. So more and more people were spending time outdoors.
Mm,
So this contemporary movement is much broader than just conservation or preservation, but they're still very important. But there are more contemporary concerns such as like concerns over pollution and toxic waste. So they're just added onto the cause.
mm.
So during this movement, the federal government starts to like take on a bigger role. So they are in charge of the important legislative and policy changes.
And I guess the tactics were really quite different, weren't they? I mean, at first, the first wave of movements was really trying to pressure successfully the federal government to create these national parks. And the second movement had a lot more diverse tactics, including rallies and protests. And do you think that, according to the author, it pretty much worked?
Yes.
I'm going to just assume that that's a thumbs up. Yeah. What the author described to me was a real string of successes in the 60s and 70s. So really important legislation like the Clean Air Act and the Wilderness Act established new understandings of the legitimacy and importance of protecting the environment. So the movement of the 60s really, successfully mobilized politicians to act in a way that we can only wish we could see today. So the mainstream movement now, I guess, when I look at it through the author's eyes, it's just an extraordinary story of success. One of the points is that somewhere between 20 and 40 million Americans are members of environmentalist groups, which is just a wonderful achievement. 10% of the population or more. And the groups number in the thousands, with some of them having not just a national branch, but local and state branches. So just a real potential to have influence and to inform policy at every level of government, but also to contribute to local environments and the monitoring and wisdom that's needed to protect the environment. The groups range in size, of course, with most of them being quite small and ephemeral. One of the groups, called the Nature Conservancy, is really much bigger than the others in terms of budget. And it has 66% of the assets of the entire environmental movement. And something crazy like, I've lost my notes here, but a significant share of the income. And the reason for that is that they've taken up the approach of buying land and setting it aside for wilderness. So they've kind of funnel, instead of lobbying the government on the idea of private action through their group. But there's other environmental groups that are called BINGOs, big international NGOs, like the World Wildlife Fund and the Wilderness Society, Conservation International. And these employ thousands of people in the US and earn together over $2 billion in income per year. So an extraordinarily effective sector. And the tactics that the big groups use, the mainstream uses, is really about research and education, lobbying, and lawsuits. And then, as I mentioned, in the case of the Nature Conservancy, purchasing land. What about the radical and contemporary movement, Napasorn? What are they like?
Okay, so unlike the mainstream groups, the radical groups are usually much smaller and they are pretty much a complete opposite. So they avoid the professionalism and bureaucraticism as seen in the mainstream groups. They have smaller budgets and they have a lot fewer members. So radical groups also kind of do similar things as the mainstream groups. So like they do the research, education, but they also do direct action tactics, which are kind of like extreme actions. So this usually includes like property damage and sabotage. So like for example, they would contaminate the fuel in the bulldozers at logging operations, or they would have inflatable rubber boats and kind of put them between whalers and whales.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
Australians are pretty familiar with the Sea Shepherd Society, which is one of those groups. And other groups in this camp include groups like Greenpeace and Earth First, with a real range of tactics. Like groups like Greenpeace probably don't do as much property destruction. And some of the latter, like there's one called the Earth Liberation Front that was even declared a terrorist organization by the FBI. So these groups are on the whole, like viewed less positively by the broader society. And I guess there's a kind of ongoing discussion about that. Andrea, were you going to talk about the social justice and the environmental movement?
Yes, so it's very important to touch on like how social justice issues has played out within the U.S. environmental movement, and it has been criticized like frequently that the origins of these environmental protection groups has some racism, classism, and sexism implications with them, and mostly is because they are like the membership of these environmental movement groups are dominantly white males, and they're from like a wealthier and more educated class, and there are not enough women and people of color they employed.
Yeah, and this was a critique that was mounted in the 70s and 80s. I mean, things have really changed with respect to gender since then. But the leadership, even now, doesn't reflect the broader community. And there is a sense that the environmental movement, as it originally developed, wasn't responsive to the concerns of people of color at all, and in fact tended to, using this preservation approach, also sometimes called fortress conservation, that they would swoop in and kind of set aside land that might have been responsibly managed by Indigenous communities or disadvantaged communities of color, and apply totally ineffective conservation approaches that are professionalized while preventing the local humans from interacting with their environment. So those kinds of concerns have led to a change in the movement, according to the author, with more sensitivity and more awareness, and to some extent, changes in the membership and leadership of environmental groups. In the last section of the chapter, the author talks about environmental conservation in Western Europe and the Global South. And the story is in Western Europe is very similar to that of the US. The two movements are closely interlinked and have a lot of mutual ties of support. And the Global South is really quite different, where the environmental movement has historically come from the leadership of Indigenous peoples and what are called peasants, which refers to farmers that are farming their own small plots of land. And so, for one, it has never accepted the idea of wilderness apart from humans, but rather takes a broader view that humans are a part of the natural environment, and that any alienation or separation between humans and nature is itself part of the problem for the destruction of the earth. So they tended to take a conservation approach that matches concern for the natural world and concern for the livelihoods of local peoples. And the contrast is really with the colonial interests. So, of course, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, invasions by Europeans and in the modern world by foreign companies, often based in North America and Europe, are associated with grabbing land and destroying the earth. So resisting colonialism and these foreign firms is part of the environmental movement, and that's led them to challenge and consider the role of American and European NGOs in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, where again, it's been criticized for being not just ineffective, but counterproductive and morally wrong. So the idea is that these foreign environmental agencies have often swooped in and tried to set land aside, separating locals who've been managing it for centuries and thousands of years, and often being unaware and insensitive to corruption and inequality and governance issues. So again, a critique that's been made by the local environmental movement, which is hopefully influencing the mainstream environmental movement to become more aware and to be less destructive in embracing these practices. And in the conclusion, the author kind of reflects on the importance of the conservation work as a whole and its many positives, but also highlights the need for more attention to the non-Western European, non-American movements and their achievements and the barriers they face, and also talks about the importance of looking beyond the public sector as more and more environmentalists are thinking what can be done through the private sector and in partnership, as well as trying to take back the idea of a government that's for the people and for nature, because we're all part of nature and interconnected. So I guess in reflecting on this chapter, I would say I learned quite a lot about the American environmental movement. I am Canadian, as some of you will be able to hear from my accent, but I was certainly not aware of the rich history of the American environmental movement. And since I've been based in Australia for 20 years, probably haven't really understood their evolving context with the mainstream and radical groups and the growing concern for social justice and for the relationship of the global North and South. So I learned a lot in this chapter and I found it kind of enjoyable. What about you, Andrea?
Yeah, I really enjoy reading the chapters, and it's also very inspiring to see like there are different strategies that the US people apply to like kind of conserve and preserve their natural resources. And one thing I especially take from this, like one key message I take from the chapter is how we have to, when we are just like have this passion to protect our natural habitats, it's also important to bear in mind that we have to apply appropriate strategies that not to expand the social inequities in this area. And it's very sad to see when the government is applying this preservation policies and chasing the indigenous people and their local communities out of their natural habitat. And I think we should, when we are applying this kind of policy, we need more connection and communication with the local people in order to protect their life quality as well.
Yeah, that's right, and show respect for their indigenous authentic ownership of the territory, rather than swooping in and stealing it for whatever reason. Yeah, what about you, Napasorn?
I thought it was interesting to see how the historical factors play a role in environmental conservation. So, like what happened in America's past, such as the closing of the US frontier, or like World War II, or even other reform movements that were happening during that time. And it's interesting to see how they influenced the conservation movement and made it what it is today.
Yeah, I agree. And I've really enjoyed reading all the chapters in the handbook, but this one's a great example of that. Just really broadens your understanding. Well, I'll say thank you to you both. Thank you, Andrea and Napasorn, for being part of the recording. And thank you to our viewers for being here with us today. Bye now.
For those of you watching, be sure to subscribe and follow us at Social Change UQ, and check out our website for more videos.